Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University, Belfast. This is LawPod.
Hello and welcome to LawPod. I am Dr. Lauren Dempster, a lecturer in the School of Law at Queen's University, Belfast. I am delighted today to pick up on our PhD series, and I am joined by Nikhil Narayan. He is one of our PhD candidates currently in the school. Nikhil, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your PhD project?
Sure. And first of all, thanks very much, Lauren, for having me on this series. Happy to discuss it with you. My name again is Nikhil Narayan. I'm in my third year of my PhD here at the law school. And the sort of working title of my project is Transitional Justice and State Accountability for Atrocity Crimes, Judicializing Guarantees of Non-Recurrence. And to maybe give a further brief summary of what that exactly means, the project intends to examine the scope and application of the obligation to provide guarantees of non-recurrence or non-repetition, both terms used interchangeably, as a core but under-scrutinized pillar of transitional justice. And looking at Sri Lanka and Myanmar as case studies anchoring a comparative cross-regional analysis, the threshold research question that the project aims to answer is, to what extent can and does international law effectively oblige post-conflict states to undertake guarantees of non-repetition?
Great, thank you for that introduction, Nikhil. So I guess a useful starting point for our listeners would be if you could explain a bit about what guarantees of non-recurrence are, and at least in theory, what their role is in transitional justice.
Sure. And I guess the very simplified form of understanding guarantees of non-repetition as they are sort of applied and understood in transitional justice particularly is really they are the, one can say, the panoply of reforms that post-conflict or post-authoritarian transitioning states and societies undertake to address the sources of conflict or human rights abuses that were committed during that past prior era, with the aim of, as the name implies, preventing that same violence and abuse from recurring or repeating. But perhaps a more robust and more useful definition for our purposes for the project and for understanding it in the context of transitional justice comes from the UN Secretary General's 2004 report, perhaps, which has now kind of come to represent a sort of authoritative and the conventionally accepted description of transitional justice and its constituent parts, one of which being guarantees of non-repetition. And if I can, I have it in front of me so I can simply read that definition. And the UN Secretary General's 2004 report on the rule of law and transitional justice in post-conflict societies defines transitional justice as the full range of processes and mechanisms associated with a society's attempts to come to terms with a legacy of large-scale past abuse in order to ensure accountability, serve justice, and achieve reconciliation. These may include both judicial and non-judicial mechanisms with differing levels of international involvement or none at all, and individual prosecutions, reparations, truth-seeking, institutional reform, vetting, and dismissals, or a combination thereof. So what's interesting about that definition is that you'll notice he doesn't specifically refer to guarantees of non-repetition, but it's what is implicated is there is that and is reflected in historical practice of TJ, from its sort of formative inception, is that guarantees of non-repetition have largely centered on things like vetting, which is to say the removal of perpetrators or former regime loyalists or other bad actors from justice and security sector institutions of the prior regime, and institutional reforms of those particular institutions. So reforming the justice sector, the judiciary, the prisons, the police, the army, um, those institutions associated with that are implicated in the most egregious, the most directly implicated in the abuses of the prior era.
Great, thank you, Nikhil. I mean, it seems already like we're getting a little bit to some of the potential issues and challenges around understanding guarantees of non-recurrence, but could you say a bit more about the specific rationale for your project?
Yeah, and the impetus for my project really, for me, kind of was born out of my own sort of experience in my past incarnation as a human rights advocate in the field, working for various human rights organizations, doing transitional justice work in various parts of South Asia and elsewhere in Africa and elsewhere. And this gradual recognition over time that there is a critical gap in sort of the peace and justice movement, I suppose one can say. So we have, transitional justice, and the international justice community has evolved a number of institutions and norms to address individual and even in some cases state responsibility for past crimes committed, for human rights abuses committed in the past, and yet this has done very little to deter, prevent, ongoing conflict and ongoing abuses elsewhere. And one of the despite its recognition as a principle in theory under transitional justice and broadly international law and human rights law in general, there is no coherent framework for this future forward-looking element of transitional justice with regards to prevention of future recurrence of violence and abuse. And without such a coherent framework that would articulate more clearly states' obligations in this regard, and leaving it to sort of the vagaries of policy and development and peace building, kind of the more the political side of negotiating such processes, states have very little incentive to undertake those specific necessary reforms that they would need in order to combat those structural roots of conflict and ensure that they don't happen again. So as a result of those roots of conflict, the infrastructure of violence and conflict, whether it be those bad actors or it be those institutions that have not yet fully uh, turned a corner, they remain intact, and we see violence and abuse perpetuating on an ongoing basis. And as I sort of alluded to, while it's recognized in principle and in theory under various streams of international law and as a core principle of transitional justice, the literature has not really developed too much clarity on what this means, this sort of principle of guarantees of non-repetition actually means in actual fact. And looking at South Asia, why I chose to look at South Asia, because um, this same sort of scholarly gap is particularly acute in the South Asian region, despite the South Asian region, many of the countries in the South Asian region being sites of gross human rights abuses, mass atrocities, even core crimes such as crimes against humanity and war crimes and arguably genocide even. And so despite a lot of kinetic energy happening on the ground by peace and justice activists in those countries, the literature has also not really investigated South Asian experiences fully. So I thought that, and particularly given my own sort of personal experience, professional experience on the ground there, I had a particular affinity to sort of be the one that maybe takes a crack at it.
Great,
So,
thank you, Nikhil. In terms of your specific focus on Sri Lanka and Myanmar, could you say a bit about why you've selected those two sites specifically, and perhaps tell us a little bit more about your research methods more broadly?
sure. Yeah, so as I alluded to, so I think the South Asian region, Asia in general, and in particular the sub-region of South Asia has been relatively neglected or at least under scrutinized in terms of mainstream transitional justice discourse in terms of what's happening. And this is despite the several of the countries, and including particularly the two case study countries, Sri Lanka and Myanmar, being places where there's been um, gross human rights abuse, long intractable conflicts and various forms of authoritarian regimes, gross abuses. And in particular, we're witnessing in both of these countries a backslide towards authoritarianism and potentially towards conflict, sowing the seeds of unrest for potentially violent conflict in the future, if not even already. Um, And so I thought, and it would be useful to look at these two particular countries, especially given their sort of somewhat troubling trajectories of recent times, going backwards towards their authoritarian and abusive pasts. Methodologically, of course, initially when I started this project, I had hoped and intended to conduct in-country field research in both, or at least one or the other country, or both countries if possible. Of course, unfortunately, the pandemic has kind of thrown a wrench into those plans. And so it's forced me to sort of restructure a little bit the empirical component of my research. But nevertheless, I'm hoping that I'll be able to do at least a select number of remote interviews in country doing field research, both principally with civil society or victims and victims organizations, and but also hopefully officials if they would be available and willing to speak with me. Again, given the not so friendly turn that both governments in both countries have taken, that might be harder to achieve now. But hopefully, I'm also counting on my sort of existing contacts and networks there that might open a few doors if possible. But in any case, the remote interviews that I will be doing in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, or with individuals in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, will hopefully serve as if not a broadly comprehensive, in-country fact-finding, empirical investigation, at least an indicative survey of what's happening in the guarantees of non-repetition space, or in the reform and reconciliation space in these countries, that can then serve as a frame of reference for a broader comparative analysis.
Great. Thank you, Nikhil. I really hope some of those interviews work out for you. Um,
So do I.
so you're at the start of your third year now of your PhD. So, I mean, you touched on already, like the issue that lies at the heart of guarantees of non-recurrence is that very point of non-recurrence. And that fits into a sort of broader shift in transitional justice. Not a shift, perhaps, but a call from some transitional justice researchers for transitional justice to be more transformative and to address those sort of structural harms or underlying inequalities. I assume at this point you have been very well across the literature on this. So, like, what are your thoughts on the potential for transitional justice to be transformative, and how do you think guarantees of non-recurrence can fit into that picture?
Yeah, so this is the at the crux of where my research is at this current stage. So please don't hold me to this a year from now, but I would um, I would argue that transitional justice can be transformative to the extent that it is enabling or unleashing sort of, or facilitating the already existing but perhaps latent or dormant or fledgling transformative forces that are indigenous to these societies in transition. And what I'm thinking of in particular, and hopefully my comparative and empirical work will verify or counter this, is looking at where the transformative potential is amongst the local communities already on the grassroots movements and grassroots efforts that are happening in the reconciliation and reform space, those human rights activists and the victims groups and so forth, and looking at it from a ground up, contextualized and a locally driven process. Um, but I think the transformative nature of transitional justice ought to be viewed more as a process oriented and perhaps a dialectical approach, rather than any sort of finite end state that we're hoping or expecting to see in 5 years or 7 or 10, or whenever the international donor money runs out. When what I guess, to sort of more elaborate more on that is, um, I also think of it, as I said, I use the term dialectic, and I think of it as also the process has to be self-reflective and self-correcting. And this is not just in the academic sense, where as academics we look at what we analyze and we scrutinize and we maybe come up with theories post fact in various contexts. But I think as practitioners, the transitional justice sort of community needs to sort of look at the work that they're doing the sort of the transitional justice and guarantees of non-repetition for policy implementation itself needs to be viewed as a long-term, ongoing, self-corrective process, because policy measures, transitional justice measures and processes that have come to, that we now come to understand as TJ, as transitional justice, are themselves become endogenous variables, so to speak, in the local context, and they themselves create and modify incentive structures and demands of the local communities, and those demands and incentives are moving targets, and so the TJ project has to move along with that, and that requires a more flexible approach, a more context-driven approach, and again, looking at transformation rather than any sort of finite goal of seeing some very ideal type liberal democracy with the Constitution and human rights and so on and so forth, recognizing we have to work within the system, work within the local context, and support the grassroots initiatives that might be oftentimes, especially in places like in South Asian, these South Asian case study examples that I'll be looking at, particularly where the states themselves are and the vested or the entrenched, structures are themselves quite intransigent and themselves hurdles to transitional justice, not the enablers of transitional justice. It's going to require a broader thinking to understand what that transformation is and what that time scale is of that transformative process.
Yeah, that's a really interesting response, Nikhil. I guess one of the things that is striking, and it's perhaps an unfair question before you've done your empirical research, is obviously if we think generally about guarantees of non-recurrence and some of the things that you touched on at the start, um, around the types of processes that entails, they're very much state-led and top-down. But now when we think about what transformative justice can look like, that's very much bottom-up. How how do you think guarantees of non-recurrence at a grassroots level can work? What do you think they would look like if they were bottom-up rather than elite-led, I guess?
Well, so yeah, and it's hopefully the empirical work will clarify this for me. But what my research is kind of coming to, giving me an understanding now, is I think transitional justice discourse has broadly accepted the need for more holistic approaches. The terms, the language, the terminology of holism has kind of is well used. It's well used, but what that really means, I would say, in guarantees of non-repetition in particular, is looking at more a dynamic view of institutional reform, for instance. And what that might also mean is getting beyond looking at what institutional reforms up to now have taken a very technocratic approach to reform as such. Basically, capacity, what might basically might be referred to as capacity building, or the vetting process, or training up judges on human rights law and black letter human rights law, or giving them, professionalizing the judiciary by giving them more computers, very sort of technocratic solutions to what is understood as institutional reform, and getting beyond that and looking at more sort of institutional reform as a sort of relational or dynamic process, and looking at sort of informal institutions, the people and the behaviors of those people, and the incentive structures that incentivize certain behaviors in those people that inhabit those institutions, and addressing those relational dynamics. And that more, and going further deeper into that, is it's important to, I would suggest, that we have to look at the power dynamics, the social hierarchies, or the political hierarchies, or the other various power dynamics that contextualize uh, these specific contexts, these societies, in each of these societies. And what my research is suggesting to me is that one way of looking at this, one way of understanding this, is to sort of take something analogous to what in development and peace building is quite well applied, quite well utilized, is sort of this notion of applied political economy analysis, and to look at what is happening in the ground, what is happening in sort of in the reconciliation and reform space, not so much in terms of the static, have they have they professionalized the Ministry of Justice, or have they professionalized the judiciary, but rather a threshold inquiry of understanding these various relational dynamics. What are the societal imbalances? What are the power hierarchies? What are the uh, social hierarchies and power dynamics in a country? And then the specific reform measures will reveal themselves, or hopefully will be reflective of addressing those power dynamics, those relational um, dynamics in each society. So I think guarantees of non-recurrence should look more in terms of institutional reform from this dynamic view, this more sort of relational view, this more sort of political economy view of what is not just the monolithic building of the court or this piece of paper called a constitution, but what are the dynamics that need to change to disrupt or alter the incentive structures that cause the behavior of those various actors inhabiting those institutions to do the things that they're doing. And this can be led by if using this sort of theoretical framework or this conceptual framework, I'm hoping that when I do look at what's happening on the ground, or when I continue, as I'm starting to look at what's happening on the ground in my case study countries, using this sort of more political economy approach, for lack of a better word, um, it'll be a conceptual framework which will give some understanding and context to what is happening, both from a state-led and from a non-state-led perspective. So whatever reconciliation efforts are happening by grassroots organizations in Sri Lanka, for instance, women's organizations doing reconciliation work at a very grassroots level, that are looking at it through the lens of this more dynamic approach, might reveal um, the impact that it's having, perhaps not on the judiciary as such, but maybe on those social institutions of communal harmony, and then the gender and caste and ethnic hierarchies that are themselves indirectly but very much at the root of the conflict.
That's a really useful point, Nikhil. Actually, it made me reflect on, like, if we think about one of the broader critiques in transitional justice of its sort of lack of engagement with the local, whatever we might mean by that, um, and the sort of shift towards potentially engaging more with local dynamics, but in a way that's perhaps quite instrumentalizing or tokenistic. But actually, if, as you mentioned, like, we look at the actual relationships and power dynamics there, that arguably sheds more light on what that looks like. So it sounds great, and I look forward to seeing the publications that come from your thesis. I can think about those down the line. Uh, so obviously, Nikhil, you've touched on this a little bit already, and I'm aware that you've yet to do your fieldwork. But what do you think, like, the sort of key findings or the most sort of interesting points will be coming out of all of this?
Well, just hopefully starting from that, what I just referred to, I'd like to I'd like to be able to get I'm hoping to sort of identify a more um, richer understanding, or a more robust understanding of, again, I'm going to use a sort of phrase that's kind of has gotten into mainstream transitional justice literature, but a broader sort of understanding of the menu of options that states and societies can and ought to be implementing in the realm of prevention of recurrence. And as particularly, what are those menu of options of those broader understanding of those measures that are civil society led, or grassroots led, or locally led, not getting beyond sort of this, seeing what various communities have done that have been effective, or perhaps not effective, or where can the international community support these local initiatives better, and give a broader understanding of guarantees of non-recurrence beyond simply those very sort of national level, state-centric reform of the higher judiciary, so to speak. But what are the initiatives that happened at a more at a more non-state level, or local level, or subnational level, that are equally having an impact on this objective of prevention? And like I said, I think beyond that, so giving some broader context from South Asian experiences to this larger, a more robust or holistic understanding of guarantees? And by extension, where can practitioners and where can the international community or the international scholarly and practitioner community in transitional justice, engage to support these initiatives, or transplant them elsewhere, perhaps, if they're effective and contextually can be correlated elsewhere?
For sure. I also wanted to pick up on one of the points you mentioned earlier, Nikhil, around how states have little incentive to sort of engage with guarantees of non-recurrence. What do you think could bring us to a point where, I mean, as we know, obviously in transitional justice, without political will, it can be very difficult for anything to move. So what do you think would need to happen in that regard?
This is a great question, and this is kind of how my project has evolved to somewhat, from, even as the working title suggests. I began looking at this project very much from a legalistic sort of approach, and from an international law standpoint, kind of thinking to myself that perhaps the answer is we need more robust international law enforcing more hard obligations on states. But you're right. I mean, that's probably not that may not be the answer, perhaps not the answer. Um, if we look at other regions, for instance, in Latin American countries, they've had the a lot of the reforms and what became sort of understood as guarantees of non-repetition or reparation, and broadly, was led by some of the initiatives of the Inter-American Court there, the regional court there. In Asia, in South Asia, there is no such regional human rights court. Of course, in Southeast Asia, they have ASEAN, but we can discuss its its virtues or flaws later. But it doesn't constitute a court, and even to that extent, South Asia doesn't have anything along those lines. So yeah, without some sort of enforceability, nevertheless, I would imagine that through my, well, not that I'm going to have the definitive answer, but I think a more coherent understanding of the principle of guarantees of non-recurrence, whether it's rooted in some sort of, you know, international law, or whether it's simply if it's a more soft law, a principle under international law, a more coherent and articulate framework of what guarantees of non-recurrence means in actual fact and in actual law, if nothing else, can be a point of reference and a bulwark for those activists on the ground that are pushing reform agendas in their countries. And they can give them something to hold on to, something to stand on foundationally, legally, and as a matter of international principle, if not law, for local activists, local victims groups, local initiatives to sort of stand on this, the same way that other aspects of transitional justice, the right to reparation and remedy, have evolved to stand for certain things in the context of justice and redress for victims and truth seeking and so forth. Similarly, um, a more articulate, more coherent framework, a foundation rooted in international legal principles, can be a bulwark for those um, activists on the ground that are pushing back against those intransigent governments, and by extension, using that foundation for their international lobbying efforts, so that they can bring in the more friendly elements of the international community to support them from outside, using those leverages.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Nikhil. I'm aware that we're at half an hour, so I'll come to my final question, I guess. Um, I wondered if you could just reflect a little bit on how you found the process of doing your PhD, and in particular, like you mentioned that you have a background in practice. So, what do you think that brought to your experience?
Yeah, I think it's certainly been pluses and minuses. I would say that on the plus side, it's been useful for me to have some sort of contextual understanding and, I would say, affinity or passion towards my project. This is very much my project, born out of my experiences, and so therefore I came to this project kind of um, wanting to work on it. And I think this is important. Um, People warn you before you start your PhD that it's a long and grueling and isolating and soul-sucking process. But especially, if you're having to, you have to focus on that same one singular discrete issue for 3, 4, or however many years it ends up being, you're going to get sick of it by the end of it. But so in that sense, I have, at least in that regard, I haven't gotten sick of it, because it is my passion project, so to speak. It's a passion project that I've had. On the flip side, certainly, I would say that one of the challenges is coming from practice as an advocate and a lawyer and a human rights advocate in the field, is that you have to deprogram your advocacy chip in your brain, and you have to think more as a scholar and an academic, as opposed to the approach to any sort of issue as from an advocacy perspective is oftentimes more black and white, one can say, and it's oftentimes you are advocating for a very specific position, and oftentimes in our work, in our field, it's very legalistic. And so as an academic, you have to be able to not take an advocacy position right off the bat. That's the point of the research. And you also have to and this is, I have to give credit to Queens and to my supervisors and to sort of the broader academic community here. I My supervisors in particular helped me very much to delegalize my thinking, let's say, and take a much more interdisciplinary and more socio-legal approach, and look at more across, uh, cross-cutting issues, and get beyond sort of a very sort of legal human rights law-based mindset, and kind of looking at more sociological questions and so forth. So, you kind of have to when you're coming, and this is true of any sort of work, any sort of experience you have. Once you're moving from field to field, shifting gears slightly, you have to deprogram one side of your way of thinking, and open yourself up to the other side of thinking. So but I've had a lot of help here, so that's good.
Sure. Has it changed how you or shaped how you think about the role of academia in transitional justice? Does it how do you feel about what academics do in that space?
Frankly, I would say it's changed my view the other way around, of how international organizations approach transitional justice. Yeah, I think much more of this sort of willingness to approach, um, to see the gray areas, is needed in practice as well. I mean, they have their own demands. The Human Rights Watch can't, dwell in the gray areas, because they have to push for certain, their job is to push for whatever they believe in, human rights and justice and accountability and so forth. But I think practice in general needs to have perhaps a look at things from a broader lens. And this goes to, perhaps my research might feed into this as well, insofar as this also speaks to the need to be not so driven by what's happening at the state or national level or the international level, and be more supportive of grassroots initiatives, and be more open to accepting non-legal or non-judicial forms of of accountability or transitional justice, and sort of living by what the Secretary General's definition himself refers to: judicial and non-judicial mechanisms, and yet the default in practice is always to the judicial mechanisms. And I think that can change. That ought to be that needs more discussion, I think.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on that, Nikhil. Yeah, I could ask you many more questions, but I'm aware that we want to keep to time, so I'll bring it to a close. So yeah, thank you so much to Nikhil Narayan for joining us today. And yeah, it's great to hear more about the PhD research going on at Queen's. And yeah, it's a topic that I was delighted to learn more about. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.